he accidentally discovers a secret hidden in their wedding photo. His wife's 2 fingers are strangely overlapped together. The meaning of this gesture is a plea for God's forgiveness, which implies that their marriage is not considered valid. The next day, Truman does not confront her. Instead, he behaves exactly as usual. He wants to see what this woman, who has lived beside him for so many years, is really hiding. As she is about to leave the house, Truman deliberately gives his wife a subtle hint.
I'll cross my fingers for you.
She freezes for a moment, then immediately puts on a perfectly practiced smile, and hurried off to work. To get to the bottom of it, he quietly follows her to the hospital where she works. A nurse repeatedly tries to stop him, so Truman can only ask her to pass along a message to his wife, then turns to leave. However, this is only a feint. Truman quickly turns back. A patient in a wheelchair suddenly charges toward Truman with all his strength as if trying to block him, but Truman easily dodges. Then another medical worker pushing a cart sways left and right, deliberately refusing to let him pass. Truman shoves the cart aside and finally arrives outside the operating room where his wife is involved. What awaits him is a clumsy performance. Just as the lead doctor is about to begin, the anesthetized patient suddenly sits up. Truman notices this abnormal moment, yet what he discovers is only the tip of the iceberg of this world. In reality, Truman was born into a massive set created entirely for him, Sea Haven Island. 5,000 cameras operate around the clock. Hundreds of millions witnessed his birth. Over 100 countries watched him learn to walk. Every move Truman makes is broadcast live, with no privacy at all. For 30 years, he has lived under cameras without knowing it. And this program is called The Truman Show. Everyone inside the show, except Truman himself, is an actor. The director plants advertisements along the roads Truman walks.
And how's your lovely wife?
Advertisements are also planted in the items his wife buys.
It's a chef's pal. It's a dicer, grater, peeler all in one. Never needs sharpening, dishwasher safe.
Wow! That's amazing!
Until one morning, on his way to work, a stage light falls from the sky and crashes onto the ground. He picks up the light, and it is labeled Sirius from the constellation Canis Major. Truman instinctively looks up at the sky, but sees nothing. This is the first unexplained event he has ever noticed. Soon after, a news report comes over the radio, saying an aircraft malfunction caused parts to fall off, so he does not think too much of it. Truman also has his own secret. When he arrives at work, he often secretly makes phone calls, asking about a place called Fiji and a woman named Sylvia. Yet he always comes up empty. Truman notices a pair of eyes in a magazine, yet sees no one around him. These eyes mean something extraordinary to him. His manager assigns him to travel to a nearby island to complete an insurance case. Truman seems resistant to the idea, but the manager warns that refusing could cost him his job. To keep this stable position, Truman can only force himself to head to the dock. He gathers his courage and walks toward the ferry, but stops beside a partially sunken boat. His legs turn weak, and he ultimately fails to overcome his fear. This is a test designed by the show's creators. When Truman was young, he and his father were caught in a storm at sea. His father accidentally fell into the water, and Truman could only watch him disappear before his eyes, leaving him with deep psychological trauma. And in the end, he retreats once again. Truman has a best friend named Marlon, someone he tells everything to, and he suddenly expresses his desire to quit his job and go to Fiji on the other side of the world. He shares this idea with his wife, but car loans and mortgages keep them firmly trapped in place. The remaining money is barely enough to live on, let alone travel. To eliminate Truman's thoughts, his wife suggests that it might be time to have a child.
This'll pass. We all think like this now and then.
Viewers cannot help but complain, because the following scenes always cut the camera away, until one day, something happens that makes him completely doubt this world. As usual, he is walking to work, when a figure both familiar and unfamiliar makes him stop in his tracks. He turns back, and it is his father, who passed away many years ago. At that moment, nearby staff members rush in. They quickly drag Truman's father away. Truman tries to chase after them to uncover the truth, but is blocked by a crowd. Missing his father once again, he tells his mother about what happened today, and as expected, She insists it is simply Truman's guilt over his father's accident. That night, he takes a bag from his personal keepsake box. Inside is a red sweater. Time goes back to a school event. A captivating girl named Sylvia appears in Truman's world, but the show has already arranged everything for him. And now an unexpected piece has entered the game. They meet again at the dance, and both feel a connection, but the show has no intention of letting her develop a relationship with Truman. Until one day, Truman runs into her again in the library. This time he gathers his courage to speak to her. The badge Sylvia wears makes him wonder how this will all end. Even he does not know. Truman invites her out on a date, and to his surprise, Sylvia agrees immediately, insisting they leave right now, or there will never be another chance. At that moment, those eyes are forever engraved in his memory. Just like that, Sylvia leads Truman away from the cameras. They leave the school and flee all the way to the seaside, where Truman gives his first kiss. The people from the show still appear, and Sylvia desperately tries to explain everything to him.
Truman,
What do they want?
listen to me. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows everything you do. They're pretending, Truman. Do you understand? Everybody's pretending.
I don't know.
No. My name's not Lauren. It's Sylvia. My name's Sylvia. Yeah.
Lauren, sweetheart, not again.
A man claims to be Sylvia's father, and takes her away from Truman.
Please, don't listen to him. Everything
going
I've
on?
told you is the truth.
Please.
It's fake. It's all for you.
I don't
And the
understand.
sky and the
Come on,
sea,
honey.
everything. It's a set.
I don't
It's a
believe
show.
it.
Everybody's
You'll be
watching
all right.
you. Please, don't
Please,
listen to him.
Lauren.
He's gonna lie to you. Watching us
going
right
on?
now.
They lie and say Sylvia has a mental condition, and that she brings every boyfriend here, just as the people from the show are about to take her away.
Get out of here. Come on, find me.
Don't worry.
Sylvia's father says that they are moving to Fiji, on the other side of the world. The naive Truman thinks he will see her at school the next day, never imagining that this goodbye will last forever. Sylvia's red sweater becomes the only proof that she ever existed. How this should end, perhaps he now has a vague idea, and Fiji becomes the beautiful place he longs for. On the back of his wife's photo are magazine clippings he has collected. He tries to piece together Sylvia's face from these fragments, and she himself has never let Truman go. Truman's awakening begins with a malfunction of his car radio. That day, the channel used by the crew was accidentally transmitted through Truman's radio. His every move is announced in advance, which causes an unexpected incident for him. The production team realizes there is a frequency issue and immediately changes it, explaining in a news broadcast that a police channel was aired by mistake. But this explanation no longer convinces him. On his way to work, he notices the front page headline about Sea Haven driving away homeless people, as if trying to prove to him that the man he met that day was not his father. Truman gradually realizes that everything seems deliberately arranged. He walks into the company's revolving door, but does not rush inside, spinning around several times before coming back out. Everything in front of him feels like it repeats every day. He starts making strange moves, clearly about to walk, yet suddenly bends down to tie his shoes. He sits aside and carefully observes the world, and finally he confirms that everyone and everything is repeating. Truman prepares to leave, when a bus brakes suddenly in front of him. At that moment he remembers there must be a green sedan passing behind him. He confidently turns around and stops it, which further confirms his suspicion. He then suddenly runs forward, abruptly turns back, and rushes into a company he rarely visits. The people inside clearly have not reacted, still repeating their routine decisions. When the elevator doors open, Truman discovers that inside is not an elevator at all, but a backstage area he has never encountered before. In the chaos, he is thrown out by security. Everything he experiences that morning leaves him deeply disoriented. At last he sees a lifeline. Truman goes to the convenience store and tells his closest friend Marlon everything he has just experienced. Yet he does not know that this so-called best friend is also just an actor arranged by the show. Truman feels as if he is being controlled, as though his entire life has never been his own. And every time he tries to leave, Marlon finds a way to pull him back.
Just between you and me, Marlon, I'm going away for a while.
Really?
Yeah.
It is that very night that he discovers his wife's secret. After the chaos at the hospital, Truman goes to a travel agency, where posters of lightning-struck airplanes have been placed by the show to discourage travel. but Truman has already made up his mind and insists on buying a ticket to Fiji. Of course, the staff refused to sell him one.
I'm sorry, I don't have anything for at least a month.
A month?
It's the busy season. You want to book the flight?
Doesn't matter. I'll make other arrangements.
Truman then takes a bus, but as it starts moving, the driver deliberately turns it into a broken-down vehicle.
Everybody off. We've got a problem.
By the afternoon, when his wife opens the car door, Truman has already been waiting for a long time. He sees through the city's operating rules and predicts them to his wife.
We will see a lady on a red bike, followed by a man with flowers, and a Volkswagen Beetle with a dented fender.
Truman, please.
Look, lady, flowers, and...
Truman, this is silly.
There it is! There it is! There's the dented Beetle! Yes!
To buy time, she agrees to go to Fiji on the condition that they save money for a few months. But just as she is about to get out of the car, Truman locks her inside.
Let's go now. I'm ready to go now. Why wait? Early bird gathers no moss. Rolling stone catches the worm, right?
He then starts the car and drives in endless circles, deliberately saying they are heading to Atlantic City, before stopping the circles and driving away. Several cars instantly appear and block the road, but there is no way he will give up. He returns to the intersection and keeps circling again, this time choosing another route toward New Orleans. Yet when he drives out, it is still the same road as before, and the traffic jam vanishes instantly. This is how Truman faces his first real challenge. He is afraid to cross a bridge surrounded by water. His wife urges him to turn back, but he grabs her hand and forces her to steer, closing his eyes and flooring the accelerator. For her own safety, his wife has no choice but to cooperate and cross the bridge. A warning screen nearby announces a forest fire, but Truman knows it is a lie. When a wall of fire appears out of nowhere, he drives straight toward it. However, just ahead, a nuclear plant incident awaits him. Police approach and order him to turn back. Truman nearly believes them, until...
Thank you for your help. You're welcome, Truman.
Truman has never met this officer before, yet the officer knows his name. Truman pushes the car door open, determined to escape no matter what, but unfortunately, he is still restrained in the woods. Truman is taken back home, where he suddenly asks his wife why she wants to have a child with him. Because he knows she does not truly love him, she mechanically replies that it is not true, then professionally picks up the cocoa drink beside her.
Why don't you let me fix you some of this new Mococo drink? All natural cocoa beans from the upper slopes of Mountain Nicaragua, no artificial sweeteners.
What the hell are you talking about? Who are you talking to?
Her evasive answer drives Truman completely over the edge. He presses closer step by step, making her increasingly nervous. As the situation spirals out of control, she grabs a kitchen tool to protect herself, only to be restrained by Truman. This makes Truman even more certain of his suspicion, and he keeps demanding to know whether she is also involved. At that moment, Marlon arrives, and only then does Truman finally lower his guard. They come to the broken bridge, and Truman tells him that they have been friends since they were 7 years old, that his unconditional trust and those memories cannot be fake. Marlon speaks gently and sincerely. His emotional words bring quiet tears to Truman's eyes. Yet the truth behind it all is nothing more than lines carefully designed by the director, word by word.
And the last thing that I would ever do is lie to you.
It is Marlon's brief pause that makes Truman realize that perhaps Marlon is one of them too. The director knows everything began with Truman's father, so he decides it should end with his father, arranging for Truman's father to appear once again, with the cameras positioned and the emotional music timed perfectly. Audiences outside the show are deeply moved by this father and son reunion. Everyone celebrates the crisis being resolved, except Sylvia, who feels sorrow for Truman's failure. Afterward, the network interviews the director, revealing that the staged drowning of Truman's father years ago was meant to create trauma and keep him in Sea Haven forever, and the results proved highly effective. The actor himself was unwilling and repeatedly tried to return to the set. This time the director solves all the trouble at once, while harvesting another wave of tears from the audience. During the audience call-in segment, Sylvia connects to the show and condemns the director's actions.
One thing, you're a liar and a manipulator, and what you've done to Truman is sick.
The director responds by saying he has given Truman a normal world, while Sylvia's true intention is to trap Truman willingly in her own prison, and she angrily hangs up the call. Next, the director plans Truman's divorce and a fresh new romance, publicly exposing Truman's private moments for the first time, until he has no secrets left at all. Sylvia gently touches Truman on the television screen. Perhaps he truly will never be able to leave that place again. Truman returns to his usual state and becomes even more active than before. The advertising routines remain exactly the same, and the director quickly arranges a second romance for him. But Truman already has his own plan. He wants to break free from this manipulated world. That night, Truman goes to sleep in the basement. His unusual behavior raises the director's suspicion, yet he does not believe Truman will actually do anything. Suddenly, he senses something is wrong and immediately orders his crew to zoom in and enhance the audio. Snoring comes through the monitor, but the director is not satisfied and orders someone to call Truman. Sure enough, the Truman wrapped in the blanket does not move at all. He plays back footage from before Truman went to sleep and discovers one of Truman's hands beneath the chair. He quickly sends Marlon to check the situation. When they enter the basement and lift the blanket, they find a snowman doll, with a pre-recorded snoring sound playing underneath. The director believes Truman cannot have left the room, so he manipulates Marlon to search the house, until evidence of Truman's escape is found inside a small cabinet.
The lawn cam. Give me the lawn cam. Don't look in the camera. Say something. Keep it going. Keep it going. He's gone. Cut transmission!
Cut transmission?
For the first time in 30 years, the show stops broadcasting. The audience has no idea what is happening. Backstage descends into chaos. Every actor is mobilized and a full search begins. Time is even adjusted forward to sunrise. Yet Truman is nowhere to be found. The director suddenly realizes the truth. They searched every corner of the town, except the one place Truman was never supposed to go, the sea. The director cuts to a shot of the ocean, and at last they find Truman. The live broadcast resumes, and the audience erupts with excitement. Truman has overcome his fear of the sea and is sailing alone across the water. He takes out the assembled photo. Sylvia bursts into tears. She is grateful that Truman never gave up, because it is she who strengthened his resolve to leave this place. To stop Truman from moving forward, the director is forced to intervene. He activates the storm program and concentrates all the wind and waves onto the sailboat. An assistant warns that Truman could lose his life, but the director believes he will be afraid and turn back. The storm arrives instantly. Truman clings tightly to the ropes, and the director controls the lightning to sever them.
Give me some lightning. Again. Hit him again.
The audience holds its breath. Truman swims back to the boat and manages to climb aboard. He removes his clothes and ties the rope around himself. The director sees Truman's struggle against fate and feels compassion. After all, this is also his child. He turns away, ready to let him go free, but a single sentence from Truman enrages him.
Is that the best you can do? You're gonna have to kill me!
The director decides to teach the kid a lesson. He turns the wind to maximum. Massive waves crash into the boat again and again, until it finally capsizes and Truman is swallowed by the sea. Only when he sees Truman lose consciousness does the director stop the storm. As the wind and waves fade, the boat flips back over, the clouds part, the storm calms, sunlight falls across the surface, and Truman survives through sheer determination. Dragging his weakened body, Truman gathers all his strength to raise the sail once more and continues toward freedom. The control room no longer interferes. Truman sails with the wind until the bow of the boat pierces the sky. He walks to the front of the boat and reaches out to touch the sky. Only then does he realize that everything is fake. He strikes the wall that deceived him for 30 years, pouring out all his emotions. Truman follows the wall and walks up a set of steps. The director sends everyone away and asks to speak with him alone. Truman finds the exit he has dreamed of. The director opens the door himself and explains everything about Sea Haven, trying to keep him there by appealing to sincerity. In this moment, he appears so small and helpless. Truman wonders who he really is. Just like his name, a real person, except for him. Everything else here is fake. Truman turns to leave through the exit, but the director warns that the outside world is just as false and dangerous. While in the world he created, Truman can live without fear.
But in my world, you have nothing to fear. I know you better than you know yourself.
You never had a camera in my head.
You're afraid. That's why you can't leave. It's okay, Truman. I understand. I have been watching you your whole life. I was watching when you were born. I was watching when you took your first step. I watched you on your first day of school. The episode when you lost your first tooth. You can't leave, Truman.
Please, God.
You belong here with me. Talk to me. Say something. Well, say something, goddammit! You're on television! You're live to the whole world!
In case I don't see ya. Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Yeah.
Truman bows to the audience. Then he turns around and walks through the exit, leaving Sea Haven behind. The audience cheers as Truman escapes his predicament, and Sylvia runs toward the long-awaited Truman. The director quietly removes his glasses. The Truman Show officially comes to an end. This is where the film concludes. In life, we are all like Truman, yet also unlike Truman. We are like him, repeating the same routines day after day, believing it is only natural. We are unlike him, because we lack the courage to seek the truth and pursue freedom. In Truman's world, there is more than just Truman alone. Although the actors know this world is fake, they willingly stay inside it. Unlike Truman, they are trapped there. Everyone is an object being controlled. When Marlon deceives Truman, the director orders him to say that he would never lie to him, words he can barely bring himself to speak. Yet as one of the controlled, he has no choice but to say what he does not mean. Truman's wife sacrifices her youth, marrying a man she does not love, smiling through it all just to earn those hard-won advertising fees.
You really ought to throw out that mower. Get one of those new elk rotaries.
The audience outside reflects most of us. We immerse ourselves in Truman's story, long for that idyllic paradise, and feel thrilled when he breaks free, as if it were happening to ourselves. He inspires all of us watching from the screen. But in the end, how different are most people from those two security guards? After admiring the achievements of others, we never dare to take the difficult first step for ourselves. The bridge over the sea that stopped Truman represents an impossible obstacle, yet there is always a way to cross it, no matter how fierce the storm may be. As long as you have the courage to fight for your life, bind yourself to the sailboat heading toward freedom. When the storm passes and the sky clears, you will raise your sail once again, looking forward to our next encounter.